sound. The reason why the cops were around all the time was because Jim Morrison, one time, he had a problem with alcohol. He was an alcohol addict, killed him basically. But he whipped it out on stage, like a Seinfeld episode. It, yes, it. And so the cops had busted him for indecent exposure and were there for all his ones afterwards. So needless to say, we're about 760. All that kind of fun stuff going on. All right, I don't have anything really to talk about other than just I'm going to conclude the modern civil rights movement and start the 60s today. I'm still working on how and where we're going to end up. I'm probably going to lean more towards social media than modern or U.S. Middle East, but I'm still kind of playing around with that. But we'll see where we are at the end of the semester. Needless to say, if I'm cutting stuff out, I'm not going to have it on the exam. I won't have it on the review guide, so just kind of keep that in mind. So what I was doing last time was, in essence, making this argument that King is going to be, in the modern civil rights movement, is going to be fairly successful in its first goal, which is to achieve legal equality, to, in essence, have the Constitution legally enforceable. Right? So you still have to take it to court, but at least now you have voting rights in the Civil Rights Act, you've got Brown versus Board, there's the legal structure in which someone can use the institutions of government to, in essence, ensure their legal equality as a citizen. The second part of that, the economic inequalities and the long-term consequences of race and racism in the United States, is a whole different subject. And by and large, as I mentioned, the southern environments had much more racial intermixing. People lived together, they had the same kind of economic status, they had the same kind of jobs. There was clearly a strong sense of race and racism, don't get me wrong in that one, but by and large you have a physical familiarity between blacks and whites in the South. That is not the case when he moves north. When he moves north, what he finds are highly segregated urban environments, and an urban environment that is increasingly being depopulated from work. So it's moving to the suburbs, it's moving out of the inner city. So all of that industrialization that we talked about in the late Gilded Age and early 20th century is no longer taking place. Those jobs are no longer there. And the ones who are left behind have no options. What do? You don't have, you have bad infrastructure, you have bad school systems, you have bad medical care. There's no focus on the one way in which you can make money is to sell drugs. And if you're a good capitalist, a lot of people are going to choose that option. King moves north into this environment, and what I mentioned, or in essence what I talked about, was that Malcolm X is already there as a more sort of accurate and legitimate spokesperson for African Americans in the North. He's not looking for compromise. He's not looking for sort of a church turn the other cheek argument. He's not looking to get into country clubs and what have you. He wants to see an end to the violence being perpetrated against these populations within an urban environment. And so Malcolm X is going to propose a very different vision than Martin Luther King. I argued that King's success is in the way in which he is going to channel the message nonviolence, civil disobedience, Christian theology. Malcolm X is basically arguing the exact opposite. And again, it's a Rorschach test of your own values. I'm not proud to say. I'm more driven by this notion of I'm not doing it and turn the other cheek. I'm a more Old Testament guy, right? I'm more of a eye for an eye kind of approach. And I made the point is that in essence, what Malcolm X is arguing is no different than what the United States established as the basic notions of what we stand for as a society. The four freedoms during World War II. These are exactly what he is kind of advocating for. And they're going to be picked up by this World War II generation, this young generation, this idealistic generation. And I closed, and I didn't show this clip because I wanted to show the complete clip, with Muhammad Ali. Right? Ali is born Cassius Clay. He rejects that name and is renames himself Muhammad Ali within the Nation of Islam. It's a fairly highly honorific title. It was given to him by the leader of the Nation of Islam, etc. They recognized that this was, from a political relations standpoint, just a great grab to get someone like Muhammad Ali as a member. And one of the things that I wanted to focus on was Ali's youth, right? He's 20, and he's raised in a post-World War II environment. And he's very much like what we're going to see in the 1960s with the boomers, and subsequent generations, Gen X, Gen Z, whatever generation you guys are now. I think you're Gen Y, I don't know what the hell they are. Yeah, it's hard to keep track of this stuff. The millennials, right? Then each of those generations legitimately are going to make the realization that they're raised in an environment that is very different from the 1930s in the case of Muhammad Ali. Just as you were raised in an environment in the teens and noughties and the teens that is very different from the 1980s and the 1970s, right? And so when you see Muhammad Ali, it's as much his youth culture as it is anything else. So he's going to win the title against Sonny Liston. I mentioned last time that he had this verbal wit about him. Sometimes he would go too far in terms of kind of castigating his opponents. I think the worst was to Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier's just this phenomenal both athlete and human being. And Muhammad Ali, to gin up interest in a fight, basically refers to him as an Uncle Tom, which is pretty nasty stuff when you're talking about a guy who was born in one of the worst environments that you can imagine in Baltimore. But Ali's success is emblematic not only of this different kind of thinking, but also of what's going to bubble up, which is youth culture and this notion of a new generation. So the reason why I stopped this was because he really does look like you guys. You may not feel it. What I see. Again, we're going to try and get him we're going to try to get him to give the poems and all this sort of stuff.
A new era in the heavyweight division was born. A brash young man with a mouth as big as his fist had become the heavyweight champion of the world. After he won the crown, he would be recognized as Muhammad Ali, a Muslim in the Nation of Islam. Although the press still called him Cassius Clay, Ali felt that this was a name given by slave owners, an unworthy name for a heavyweight champion. He was proud of his race, religion, and most of all, this historic accomplishment.
Here is someone who is unwilling to take a second-class citizenship status and say, oh, well, thank you so much for allowing me to ride in this section of the bus, right? He's not looking externally for someone else to validate his values, who he is, what he represents. And that's what we're going to see in the 1960s, is that the culture, the counterculture of the 1960s is going to be hyper-focused on individualism, not consensus. This is who I am. These are my values. And again, as Americans, that's what the Constitution allows. For you to, I'm a bad mouth, I'm pretty, right? This idea of being proud of yourself and being, your own best advocate. So Ali is going to bring along this sensibility and kind of merge it with the broader tendencies that are going on in the North. This is all part of a rising movement that is focused on identity politics. It is not condensed into the modern civil rights movement. The modern civil rights are contending to it. But identity politics effectively says your political persuasion comes from who you are, not your thinking process, but your race, your gender, your religion, your sexuality, right? The way in which you identify, the way in which you see yourself. Again, before this, the general assumption was you saw yourself as an American. You saw yourself as part of a group. E pluribus unum, from many one. Right? We the people. Increasingly, what you see in the 20th century is this drift towards individualism, with social media putting it on steroids. So again, the idea of looking at social media at the end of this class makes a lot of sense in regards to this. This Afrocentrism is largely going to be focused in cities. Oakland, Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Atlanta, etc. And it is largely, what you see as they develop, are largely rejecting the ideas that the origins of the modern civil rights movement are going to hold. Congress of Racial Equality, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, all of the things that kind of drove the passage of this legislation are going to be seen as sort of indicative of taking a second-class citizenship status, of being an Uncle Tom, of somebody who's willing to accept what's given to them by the majority white population. And it has real kind of pathologies to it, right? If acting white means getting a college education, then you're putting pressures on your own society, your own neighborhoods, to avoid getting a college education. Again, I go back to that image that I use of capitalism. Tiger don't care. Tiger doesn't care how big of a fan you are of this, that, or the other thing. Or Tiger's like, you got skills, right? And college education is required. And so this idea of saying, well, I'm going to fly the flag and be an identity politics individual by hurting myself economically has its own consequences. The rejection of Martin Luther King by 1964 and 1965 is largely based on this idea of identity politics, of saying what King's argument is that the African American population is defined by what the white population is going to allow for them, right? It is mixed into a lot of anti-colonial wars. So in the 1960s, what you see are a lot of European powers being forced out of Africa. And obviously, we've got the Vietnam War is just starting to break, where you've got this question of why are we there, right? What's going on there? It sure looks like a colonial possession that wants to be done with people other than Vietnamese kind of calling the shots. So this component is much more heavily cultural than economic. My wheelhouse, right, what I do, and the cultural component of it is going to have a long-term consequence in our politics, which I'll get to in just a second, right? What the Panthers do and why they're so popular, again, the Super Bowl halftime show and all that kind of stuff, and putting the X out there, all triggering aspects. Oh, how could you do this? How could you not do it? What the Panthers do is actually very familiar to what we've seen before in terms of grassroots social gospel progressivism. What they do is, in essence, try to change the environment for black people in these inner cities. One of the things they did, they didn't have cell phones, right? But they would take instant pictures, they were instamatic pictures. They still had to be developed and all the rest of that stuff. But they would wait to see someone was arrested. They would get to a legal distance around and take photographs. Why? Because police brutality was very common and the ability to rough people up, regardless of whether or not they're guilty or not, right? We have a trial, etc. Strongly affirming, probably the biggest element of the Black Panther Party is affirming the idea of internal beauty, of just rejecting a standard of beauty. Right? Today we would call it sort of body image, right? But the idea of how you're shaped and your hairstyle and your lips and your butt and your whatever, all of that stuff is going to be seen for what it is, and that is an established vision of beauty by somebody else. One of the things I talked about in class is that the key thing, self-awareness of college students, the key thing you have to leave college with is an awareness of who you are, and recognize the one person who you can guarantee is going to be in your corner is sitting in that chair, in the same chair you are right now, right? And so there's an affirmation going on here of saying, in essence, that black is beautiful kind of mantra. It's not saying anyone else is unbeautiful. It's saying, in essence, that you have to take pride in who you are first and foremost. The others, obviously, meals or the breakfast programs and what have you. It falters in 1968, and that's when the Black Panther Party basically splits, or Black Panther movement basically splits. And it becomes, some splinters of it become much more directly challenging of police authorities, the war in Vietnam, et cetera, et cetera. So by 68, when we get to 68, the wheels are coming off. We should be familiar with that. The wheels are coming off, it seems, of American society. And it's a very different Black Panther movement than what you see in 1964 and 1965. Right? All of this kind of begins to weaken the modern civil rights movement. And the question is why? And one element is, baby with the bathwater, you don't evaluate the modern civil rights movement without understanding the fact of where it started at in 1945. And that was a completely segregated, legally segregated country. What it does is successfully overturn them. Whether you want to credit activists, which I tend to do, whether you want to credit lawmakers, whether you want to credit the white majority that is electing these lawmakers, whatever. What you see is, in essence, the ending of legal segregation in the United States, a major transformation. But it weakens in large part, I would argue, because of the northern and southern differences. What you lose is this unified mission that King is going to be able to ascribe to it. And what King is going to do is recognize that the Vietnam War kind of lies at the heart of this. It is a violent expression of American policy. Wars are violent, right? But what is its aim? Its aim, in essence, is to control, to direct, to tell another country, in this case a country of Asians, what the United States wants them to do. And so the war itself is going to provide an element of violence by the state that is going to run counter to King's messaging, right? Violence does not translate into democratic change. We've seen that before. January 6th, whatever, breaking windows in Seattle, is that violence tends to produce a gridlock when it comes to the debates of what is the source of the issues that take place. There are riots that begin to expose this in numerous locations, Houston being the closest. But notice how many of these are in the north, right? What about the bad old South? The North is equally to blame in regards to the way in which the civil rights movement is historicized and how it's expressed. Congress of Racial Equality and Student Nonviolent Reporting Committee both break away from the nonviolent pact that they had agreed to with Martin Luther King by 1968. Right? So there's a separation that's taking place by this point in time. I'm going to pass on Baldwin because we've done this. We'll turn to this guy, Martin Luther King. So King is going to be talking in 1967. He's assassinated in April of 1968. Right? So it's less than a year left in his life. But he's talking about the way in which this conversation has broken down. And he is going to center the Vietnam War in this, not as an opposition to the United States, but as an example of kind of violence as policy, accepted policy. Well, if we break down, we just beat someone's head in. If we break down, we can just intimidate somebody. If we break down, we can just send a mob up to Capitol Hill and prevent a new president from being nominated or listed as incoming president. So King is going to be prescient in a lot of the arguments that he's going to be making here. And it also, it counters nicely with, that clip that I showed you before, which you heard that.
I must confess that that dream that I had that day has at many points turned into a nightmare. Now, I'm not one to lose hope. I keep on hoping. I still have faith in the future. But I've had to analyze many things over the last few years, and I would say over the last few months. I've gone through a lot of soul-searching and agonizing moments. And I've come to see that we have many more difficult days ahead, and some of the old optimism was a little superficial, and now it must be tempered with a solid realism. And I think the realistic fact is that we still have a long, long way to go, and that we are involved in a war on Asian soil, which, if not checked and stopped, can poison the very soul of our nation. I'm not going to say that all of our problems will be solved if the war in Vietnam is ended, but I do say that the war makes it infinitely more difficult to deal with these problems. When a nation becomes obsessed with the guns of war, it loses its social perspective, and programs of social uplift suffer. This is just a fact of history, so that we do face many more difficulties as a result of the war. It's much more difficult to really arouse a conscience during a time of war. There is something about a war like this that makes people insensitive. It dulls the conscience. It strengthens the forces of reaction, and it brings into being bitterness and hatred and violence. I think the biggest problem now is that we got our gains over the last 12 years at bargain rate, so to speak. It didn't cost the nation anything. In fact, it helped the economic side of the nation to integrate lunch counters and public accommodations. It didn't cost the nation anything to get the right to vote established. And now we are confronting issues that cannot be solved without costing the nation billions of dollars. Now, I think this is where we're getting our greatest resistance. They may put it on many other things, but we can't get rid of slums and poverty without it costing the nation something. I feel that nonviolence is really the only way that we can follow, because violence is just so self-defeating. A riot ends up creating many more problems for the Negro community than it solves. You can, through violence, burn down a building, but you can't establish justice. You can murder a murderer, but you can't murder through violence. You can murder a hater, but you can't murder hate. And what we are trying to get rid of is hate and injustice and all of these other things that continue the long night of man's inhumanity to man.
Stuff there. I mean, the more you study, I mean, everyone always has this kind of cardboard cutout of these great things, these great people, right? You know, Lincoln is a perfect example of that. King is another one, and we're going to talk about one, Lyndon Johnson, in just a second. The more you actually know of this person, see this person talk, you realize that they are moderate. They are trying to find a middle ground. And yet at the same time, what do we know of King? What do we know about Lincoln ended the Civil War, blah, blah, blah. The reality is much more complex. It's a lot harder, right? And we don't like hard in this country. We want easy answers. We want short. I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
That speech was in 67.
67.
The I Have a Dream speech was in
63.
63. So from 4 years, he went from that to.
Yep. And in large part, what has changed, he's gone north. He's seen a different African-American population. They are suffering under, or they are living under very different economic circumstances. And, you know, one of the clear differences is that, at least in the South, they're living side by side. And for the most part, the poverty is shared. I don't want to take, mostly what they're dealing with are poor whites, and they are poor blacks. And so the economic distinction isn't as sharp. Here it is. Here there's a real racial dividing line between opportunity. I didn't bring the books in, but I had the books from last time, When Work Disappears. There is no work. There's no opportunity, and we're talking here in the 60s and 70s. That changes. What are they supposed to do? Yeah.
I'm just curious, how did it happen that the segregation happened in the North? Because originally the South was the ones that were for slavery.
Yeah.
But then.
No, it's a great question, and the answer is property values. It's It's to protect property values. So the racism is the same one way or the other, right? And if you opened up a settlement of affluent blacks, what you would see is white flight. So if I'm living in a neighborhood and a black person moves in 1954, oh my God, or a Jew, right? And needless to say, no one would be out about their sexuality, but it would lower the property values in that. Then you get zoning, and you get grandfather clauses, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So when I was in Chicago, we moved all over the place. We were on the north side, we were in downtown, and then at the end, when my wife and I started birthing babies, and we had them as a family, we were in the west side. There literally is Chicago Avenue. There literally is a separation between the neighborhood we lived in, which was Oak Park, and West Chicago. West Chicago was burned to the ground in '68. It would barely recover in the 1990s. Barely recovered. One block over, you see suburban professors and their families living in kind of the classic suburban world. So it's very hardly, it's redlined, right? So there's real firm definitions of where you can live, right? And again, I'm repeating myself, but you go back to home ownership as the #1 nest egg for most Americans. If you deny them the ability, successful people, to move into places where they can then use that money to gain equity in their home, you've denied them the #1 engine of upward mobility in this country, right? Those are the historical realities that people are talking about when they talk about reparations and whatnot, right? And King is not talking about reparations, but that's what he's facing, right? So, it weakens because in large part what you see is a decline of support for modern civil rights movements by the federal government. It is dominated up to this point in time by the Democrats. Democrat support for civil rights is going to torpedo their own party in the South. We'll get back to that. Why would you do that? You sure as hell wouldn't see politicians do that today. Right? One of the problems with the Republican Party today is that they're locked into this crazed base, right, of saying, anything that comes out of QAnon is gospel truth. they're going to, in large part, face the political consequences of Vietnam, of the civil rights movement, and really heightened expectations in regards to the Cold War. And the Republicans, again, if you're somebody who looks to politicians for your heroes, we need to talk, right? Politicians win elections, or they're no longer politicians. And the Republicans see this opportunity. They see a chance of being able to anger and activate white middle-class voters and turn this into an argument not of economic opportunity, but of special privilege, right? That these people have it lucky. Oh, to be poor and black in America's northern cities. Boy, that's when you know you really have made it in America. This is the political argument, right? And you don't have to go too far to see this, right? So Philadelphia, Mississippi is a town in Mississippi. I don't know if anyone's from it. At one time, years ago, I had a student who was from Philadelphia, right? So it's like, it's known for two things. Well, three things if you count my student, right? It's known for two things. 1964, three civil rights advocates, Goodman, Cheney, and Schwerber, are going to be pulled over by the local police department and are going to be taken, because they're advocating for voting rights in the region, are going to be taken to a woods, tortured, and shot. Right? So if you've seen the movie Mississippi Burning, it's about this case. FBI is going to investigate. They're going to identify these individuals. It's not until, I think, 2004 that anyone is held accountable for this, right? So it isn't like swift justice. That's what Philadelphia, Mississippi is known for, taking civil rights activists and taking them out to the woods and shooting them. And then in 1980, Ronald Reagan is going to get the Republican nomination. He gets the nomination in St. Louis. The very first place he goes to give a speech as the nominated presidential candidate for the Republican Party is Philadelphia, Mississippi. Why go there? And you see his speech up there. Well, states' rights. States' rights is another word of saying, well, if you're going to be racist and do these things in Arkansas or Mississippi or Texas, we're going to look the other way. States' rights destroy the balance of our government by giving powers that were never intended to the Constitution of the federal establishment. Right? In essence, those radical Republicans are moving too quickly. Now, when I get to Reagan, Reagan's not racist. Reagan doesn't hate black people. Reagan wants to win elections. That's what politicians do. And he knows, his people know what he's there doing. He is greenlighting, he is putting these ideas out there for the people who are racist, who are going to vote in this regard, right? 2016, when we get to it, it's like, it's really obvious that, you know, you look at Donald Trump's background. He has no background other than being a misogynist. He has no background in politics. He simply is going to say what is necessary to get people ginned up, right? The favorite is build the wall. Trump had no policy about building walls. Zero, none, not any. He said it one time in a rally. They went nuts. It becomes a central policy of Donald Trump. Why? Because it gets people ginned up. New York Times reporter, Reagan was the first presidential candidate ever to appear at the fair. Right? Another thing, why go there? Right? He knew exactly what he's doing. His apologists have every right to be ashamed of the hero, but they have no right to change the meaning of it, which was unmistakable. Right? Which is using, in essence, these triggering words to be able to say, well, I'm this way, I'm that way. Reagan, or we'll get to Nixon, he's going to do it much more nefariously. Right? But again, I'm not castigating Ronald Reagan, a human being. I'll get back to Reagan, spend some time on it. What I am saying is that there's a political opportunity here, just like in the Cold War, to vilify rapists and murderers at the border, right? This, that, and the other thing. These concepts are ones that are going to undermine this idea of having meaningful progress in the modern civil rights movement. The focus on schools is, I would argue, as essential an American quality as there is. And that's why it's so troubling when you see in contemporary society people going after school boards and getting ginned up on things like CRT, which aren't being taught, right, in schools like that. But education is the sort of the last bastion of what Americans tend to see of themselves, and saying, in essence, if somebody's willing to work hard, because it is hard, when you graduate, you will have accomplished something. You may not look at, I only have a 2.7 GPA. No one gives a shit about GPAs. You accomplished something. You've done this. You and 70% of the rest of the country is incapable of doing it. That in essence, what you're looking at is education being that kind of lock or magic wand that's going to open up people's ideals about what it means to be successful in the United States. Little old Corpus Christi is at the heart of that, in the middle of that. Cisneros versus CCISD. 1970 does the same thing for Mexican Americans. It is a national piece of legislation, a ruling, right? That comes out of the activism by groups like the GI Forum, LULAC, and others here in Corpus Christi. If you have family members who were around in the 1970s in Corpus Christi, ask them about that. Contentious times, and getting bused and having desegregation. It's not easy to do. But I promise you, it ain't going on in China. It's not going on in Russia. It's not going on around the rest of the world. And I keep saying, look at the world around you. You're going to look a lot more like the United States does today, not less. There's this mixed legacy, and it just depends on how you look at it. If you want to look at individual achievement, there is individual achievement. For God's sakes, Barack Obama is president of the United States. You have millionaires, billionaires, whatever. Jay-Z, Oprah Winfrey, basketball players, baseball players, yada yada. Commercial culture and sports are particularly effective. Why is that? You ever wonder why? It's because money sells, money talks, bullshit walks. Right? And I studied Hollywood. Hollywood is very much based on what is successful. They don't know why it's successful. It's successful. It has, in essence, this notion of saying, if you are this kind of entertainer, if you are somebody who can capture the imaginations of the American public, you're going to be rewarded. It doesn't matter what race you are, right? And in many regards, being an outsider is, Bad Bunny or something like that. What is his gender? I don't know. What is his sexuality? I don't know. Doesn't matter. It's part of the appeal of popular culture, right? And the same thing is true of business. Business does not care. The tiger does not care. Tiger cares about profitability. So these things that don't have this ephemeral, well, you're a woman and you're gay and we're not sure about whether, none of that matters in those instances. When you look in the aggregate, however, what you still see today is that blacks on average earn about 2/3 about what the average white family earns, right? And again, aggregate statistics are not individual, but they are pretty telling. And you can certainly go to the Pew site that you're doing for the next paper and see that. Last two things is that what you see is the emergence of identity politics. Again, don't suggest one is because it appears that the cause is a modern civil rights movement. This is emerging on multiple fronts, and it's taking place at multiple levels. And as we're going to see, is that it's going to shatter this idea of consensus that exists following the Second World War. Everyone agrees, right? No, we don't. And I always kind of remind people, you go back to the 1790s, and we're just at each other's throats the same way. Federalists and Democratic Republicans, is that the political system has always been contentious. And so the 50s are more of an odd decade than they are kind of something you want to go back to, et cetera. But identity politics is driving American politics throughout the 60s and certainly 70s and up till today. And at the midst of this, I would argue, is King. Why do you have a celebration of King's birthday? It's not simply because he's African American. It's because of the way in which he's able to tap into what is ultimately the heart of the United States. To be able to understand, you could see that a little bit, the way in which he could articulate and describe to the American public their own contentious feelings, their own paradoxes, right? Everybody, and again, the political discussion we have today is everything has to be simple. Everything has to be a simple answer. It isn't, right? It's complicated, and our government is created from a constitution that specifically creates problems, bottlenecks, slows it down. We have the least efficient government on the planet, and it's designed to be that way, right? And so a lot of this, what's amazing is the way in which King is able to kind of navigate through that to get arguably two of the most important pieces of social legislation passed in the 20th century. The GI Bill in there, but Social Security. All right, contentious. There's a second half to this, which I'm not going to do simply because of the time constraints. I don't want to get locked into too much of this and then miss out on the back end of it. I will not have terms from that last component on the exam, but you can certainly look at it if you've got questions, obviously come and see me. What we're going to be turning to is obviously the 60s. I'm going to put a couple of vibes here. But before I do this, before I go into the 60s, it's at this point in time, and I've been saying this throughout the semester, liberal and conservative, those terms, they mean something, right? You can't just simply say, well, Abe Lincoln was a Republican and be a Republican today. Ronald Reagan wouldn't be a Republican today. Ronald Reagan would not get the nomination. He wins 2 landslide elections. He would not, he's too soft, he's too insensitive, he's too whatever, cocked, right? To be able to get the nomination of the contemporary. The same is probably true of the Democrats, right? You wouldn't be able to see a Lyndon Johnson get the nomination of the Democrats today, regardless of his capabilities. And so it's at this point in time we're getting into contemporary history where it is important to look at this political ideology. And I start with ostriches and seagulls, all right? So imagine, if you will, I'm not saying it is, I'm not saying it isn't, but this is my car back in 2002. I got down to South Texas, wash your car, or else you come out and it's covered in bird shit, right? And I come into class and say, damn it, I washed my car this weekend and it's covered in ostrich shit, right? An ostrich pooped on my car. And you would patiently look at me and go, Blanky, I know it's frustrating, get down to me. We don't have ostriches down here. We got seagulls, and it's probably seagull poop that's all over your car. Oh, okay, yeah. Come in the next week, same thing happens. Damn ostriches, they crapped on my car again. Can you believe it? I'm gonna get me a gun and start shooting some ostriches. Blanky, no ostriches, we got seagulls, right? But if I come in a third week and say the same thing, what are you gonna start to conclude about Blanky, right? One, he's dumb as a stump, right? Okay, Blanky, no, there's a difference between the two birds. Or, I am consciously, I am purposefully, I am intentionally ignoring the fact that there is a difference between the description of an ostrich and the description of a seagull. That's where we are with liberal and conservative today. Those words mean something. Those words are vitally important to understanding the United States. The Constitution and the law is generally, as I mentioned, a conservative document. That does not mean, school prayer and all that. It means, in essence, that it is trying to limit the power of a centralized government. So what I want to do is to just introduce and talk about, I'm going to be talking about liberalism and conservatism. One of the books I was kind of scared, Lyndon Johnson, The American Liberalism, right? I think I mentioned I had a friend of the family, and she was looking at colleges to get in, and she started crying because her major was in the College of Liberal Arts, and she's conservative. I don't want to be in the College of Liberal Arts. I was like, it's all right, Mackenzie, it's not. That's not what it means, right? He said, we live in an environment where those words liberal and conservative are trigger words, and they mean something, right? They mean something. Ostrich means something. Seagull means something. And either people are using them because of the fact that they don't understand the difference, or they're using them regardless of the fact that they're incorrectly being used because they want to trigger a response. You guys are not unsophisticated when it comes to it. You know exactly the answer to that. They're using it because generally you can get a knee-jerk reaction, all right? So I'm going to use these terms that we're going to be talking about throughout to try and talk about what's going on here. First, look at conservatism. Modern politics. Why politics? Because it's the one thing historians can at least look at. We don't know yet, even though as a cultural historian, the long-term cultural implications of social media, the long-term implications of the infield fly rule, and the cultural stuff takes a longer time in which to affect. Material, economics, politics, etc. And in addition to this is that World War II creates such a strong consensus. Why is it the good war? Because the United States emerges from it in agreement of what we stand for. Here's who we are. Here's what Superman is. Here's what Captain America is. Right? Both of those are cultural icons of the World War II era. They don't have doubts, unless you get to Civil War. Right? We'll leave that aside. They don't have a sense of who I am and what I'm here for. What you see is, in essence, this consensus built on these ideas of liberalism and conservatism. Those ideologies, this is the important one, are both founded on the same concepts. At roots, American liberals and conservatives are as close ideologically as you can possibly get. Certainly if you go to Europe and you look at the political parties there, they're totally different kind of valiance in terms of how wide they are. The United States, they're fairly close, at least in terms of who they are and what they are. Okay, first of all, conservatives. Again, if you call yourself a conservative and you don't know who Edmund Burke is, you're not a conservative. You don't know that. You don't know the basic value of, I'm a bird fan, but I don't know what an ostrich is. Who's Edmund Burke? Edmund Burke is going to be one of the early kind of intellectual arguments about conservatism. What a conservative is going to argue is, in essence, this idea that we are born with natural rights. We're born with our life, we're born with our freedom, and we're born with the control over the property we produce. And no one has a right to take those away. And you have to add, without due process, right? So no one can take away the life of the guy who walked into the subway with smoke bombs and a gun until he violates the rights of someone else. Then due process can set in. Personal property, private property is always under threat by a modern state. Right? So I'm 60 years old, you guys most in your 20s. My wife and I have amassed wealth. Let's say we decide to create our own country here, and the majority decides, hey, let's throw all our property into one pile, and then we'll just share it equally amongst ourselves. Hold on, hang on, whoa, right? That would make me conservative. I would say, in essence, no, that's my personal property. That's not a collective personal property. I know that there are things that we need to do collectively. We have to have roads, we have to have police departments, we have to have some sort of structure to society. I'm willing to grant that. But the subtraction of the state or the people to take away those freedoms, to say I can't do something. If you're a conservative, what is your view on, let's say, recreational use of marijuana? You're a real conservative. Not my issue. I've said it before in classes. If you want to light up, do it after class. Do it as a reward structure. And it's a little freakier. We'll listen to Blondie when you're sitting there toasting, right? Conservative doesn't care. Right? What about your body? What about piercings? What about abortion? What about, amputate? What about whatever the hell you want to do? A conservative says, listen, you have the right to do whatever you want to. The state can't tell you what to do. Right? That's what conservatism is about. That's what the Constitution is written about. The Constitution is written so that all of the functions, the judiciary, the legislative, and the executive branch, all fight each other. They don't get stuff done because they're constantly trying to cloud each other for political power. Right? That was intentional. It was intentional because Madison and the founders don't trust human beings, because in essence what they do is turn to culture. Right? A classic conservative, organic conservative, Edmund Burke conservative, and Goldwater is going to be, we're going to get back to Goldwater and Ronald Reagan as an example of this. These organic conservatives are in large part going to make the argument that the one thing you know is that you own yourself. You are your own master. And that any property that you produce is yours. Any wealth you produce is yours. To take that away without compensation or without due process is no different than slavery. Right? It doesn't mean you say, well, we're not going to have roads, right? Most organic conservatives are willing to say the Constitution has certain powers. Right? We have to have a military. A classic conservative would say, keep it small. I don't want a federal government with a bunch of black helicopters and NSC and all the rest of that stuff. Right? I want to make sure and have the courts avoiding political ideology. Right? But there are certain things that we as a complex modern society need to do. We need to have running water. We need to have sewage systems. We need to have roads where you don't get flat tires every time. Look at Texas roads, right? What isn't paid for by the federal government isn't paid for. And we're not willing to pay for it ourselves, which means what? One of you in this room today will in the next month probably blow out a tire or blow out an axle individually. It will cost you $500, right? The rest of us won't be so unlucky. That's the game we're playing. The alternative is every one of us pays $5 regularly and we have reasonable roads to drive, right? That argument is one in terms of how to be able to kind of see the way in which government is going to work most effectively. Right? That's what conservatism means. It does not mean school prayer. It does not mean anti-abortion. It does not mean, oh, you're gay, I have to know what you're doing to jump every weekend. Right? Those things are not conservative values. Right? Where do they come from? They come from the second type of conservatism, much more prevalent now, cultural conservatism. This is what I feel like. This is what I believe. I think the Cowboys are the best football team on the planet, and everybody else are a bunch of assholes. I think Christianity is the best. That would be more Bears versus Packers. I think anyone who's a Packer fan should be excommunicated, whatever. I'm a practicing Christian, and so I have to have this head or the other. These are all cultural phenomena. You can look through the Constitution. There's nothing about culture other than to guarantee the federal government doesn't mess with it. Right? Clearly, at this point in time, you have an entire media empire dedicated to generating cultural outrage. Outrage! Oh my God, 3-year-olds are being told about body parts. Oh my God, this is happening. Right? They're not so focused on natural rights as they are on cultural rights. Making the argument that there is a majority view of culture, and that that majority has to in essence, have their will installed. So if the majority love the Dallas Cowboys, everybody else has to be a Dallas Cowboys fan. I always use the Cowboys as an example. I got nothing against the Cowboys, but it is a, it's a cultural phenomenon. I was raised Muslim, so everyone else has got to be Muslim as well. The idea here is in large part to drive anger, drive political persuasion based on this kind of regional fear of someone somewhere being different. Un-American. Well, how do you know you're un-American? Because you put ketchup on a hot dog, right? How dare someone put ketchup? It's these absurd kind of components. Oh, because they have a bumper sticker. Oh, because they use pronouns. Oh, because they're using, and again, this notion of powerful government. Cultural conservatives want government to be checking your reproductive cycles. They want you to rat each other out if you're getting an abortion. They want you to be able to do things that are traditionally as un-American as you can possibly get. Right? Hang on, I get to go after the cultural liberals in just a second. So you're getting all hot and bothered. You go, oh, well, I don't know. You're not. But this is a clear example of the distinction between if someone calls themselves a conservative, then the first thing I would say, oh, so you like a small government. You don't want a government to be interfering with everyone's everyday life. That's what a conservative means. That means that's what pooping on your window is, right? Not the ostrich one. The third form, and the one that is relevant when we get to foreign policy, are a group called neoconservatives. And it largely coalesces around the 1970s, so Vietnam finishes the way it does. The United Nations is gaining more voice from independent, non-aligned countries, India, Pakistan, Brazil, etc., who are not aligned with the United States. And there becomes a kind of a conservative argument in foreign policy that says the United States should no longer play by the rules that we established following World War II. We shouldn't listen to the United Nations. We shouldn't listen to the OAS. We shouldn't listen to these organizations that a World War II America created. We should go it alone. And we should use our morality. We should look around and say, you're good, you're bad. We know what your heart says, right? And so Iran is bad while Iraq is good. North Korea is bad while South Korea is good, right? Axis of evil, all these kinds of evil empire, etc. This discussion of sort of a moral vision of the world. And what comes with it, when we get to the second Iraq war, right, is the decision that says we're going to go around the planet and nation build. We're going to change the nature of a country because we see it as somehow evil. Not because it presents a threat, not because it has attacked us, but because we in our moral wisdom are going to say, we don't like you and we're going to overthrow you. What would George Kennan say to this? Again, needless to say, I'm a big George Kennan fan. Patient but firm. Why don't you have a faith that you, America, are doing the right thing? And to hell with North Korea. Shut them down. Find a way in which to keep those parts from coming in. Right? Saddam Hussein, no-fly zone. Just stew in your own, fiasco that you've got in this country. There's no need to go wandering around, changing the world around you. But that's what neoconservatives. Notice that they have if you're neoconservative, you have no stake whatsoever in terms of social politics. You're not, Sarah Palin or whatever, the local Marjorie Taylor Greene or something like that. They're totally different kind of language, right? So 3 different types of conservatives. The dominant one initially is this organic conservative. Ronald Reagan is going to come out of this movement of organic conservatives, classical conservatives. And it's the reason why I would say today he would stand 0 chance of getting the nomination of the Republican Party. That's someone. Now it's cultural conservatives. Right? Same thing with liberals. How about liberals? Classical or organic liberals. Again, if you don't know who John Locke is, you can't call yourself a liberal. Right? What does John Locke argue? Sounds very much like Edmund Burke. We are born with life, liberty, and property. The same enlightened liberal values. The reason why I was talking about liberal democracies, liberal arts colleges, right? It's not that they're conservative or liberal like we understand it today, ostriches and seagulls, is that they have a basic assumption that says human beings have natural rights. And those natural rights supersede everything else, right? And so when you see somebody dying in Ukraine, you have, as a conservative or liberal, are saying they're being denied their natural rights, and I am being harmed by it. Because that's what I believe in too. That's why you're involved in those kinds of things. right? This shifts in modernity. We saw it, radical Republicans, progressivism, New Deal. What's going on? What's going on is society's changing. It's modernizing. Suddenly you got television, suddenly you got radio, suddenly you got world wars, suddenly you got Great Depressions. Modernity makes things complicated. And a liberal will step forward and in essence say, you know what? Individual liberties are very real, but so's the world I live in. You people have lives too. It's not just all about me, right? We're organic conservatives says, I don't care about you. And it's basically just kind of straightforward. A classical liberal would say, I live in an environment, right? 2012, Barack Obama got a big, Twitter war over, you didn't build that. What he's talking about is, you didn't build the road structure, you didn't build the sanitation department, you didn't build the things that make it possible for you to make money and be successful in this world. It was done collectively. And that collective action is part of what we owe each other, a social contract. We owe an obligation to each other to at least make it so that everyone can still fulfill their basic liberties. That's how liberals and conservatives, organic liberals and organic conservatives kind of differ. Organic conservative would say, I don't care about the state in any way, shape, or form. There's an organic liberal would say, the state is a reflection of the people who comprise it. It's a real thing, and it matters, right? If we have a Great Depression, you can't just allow the thing to go wildfire on you. You have to step in and do something. That's the argument that's going to be made, right? Social order and security are emerged in the 20th century as key components of this. Right? So Franklin Roosevelt, the four periods, finish that time. Sorry about that. I'll pick this up.